One of the most unsettling memories I have begins with a babysitter named Lydia. It was the summer of 2005, and my parents had to attend a wedding out of town. They arranged for Lydia, a distant relative, to watch over my sister Emma and me. She was in her mid-20s, with jet black hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that seemed to always stare just a moment too long. Something about her had felt off from the start, but I was only 10 years old and quick to dismiss things adults didn't find strange. The evening started innocently enough. Lydia ordered a pizza, which we ate on the living room floor while watching cartoons. She didn't talk much, just sat there with her legs crossed, observing us. Every once in a while, I'd catch her eyes, and she'd smile. A smile that seemed more forced than friendly. After dinner, Emma, who was only 5, started playing with her dollhouse. I decided to head to my room to read a comic book. I hadn't been up there for long when I heard Emma scream. My heart jumped, and I raced downstairs. There was Lydia, standing completely still in the middle of the living room. Her face was expressionless. Emma was nowhere in sight. "Where's Emma?" I demanded. Lydia turned her head slowly and tilted it to the side. "She's hiding. Want to play hide and seek with us?" I frowned. Emma loved hide and seek, but the way Lydia said it made my skin crawl. I tried to brush off the anxiety, telling myself I was just overreacting. But as I searched the house for my sister, the tension grew. The shadows felt deeper, the silence heavier. I could feel Lydia's gaze on me from behind me as I moved from room to room. "Emma, come out, it's time for bed," I said quietly. But there was no reply. I checked the usual spots, behind the curtains, under the couch, even in the small closet where she sometimes hid. Nothing. Panic started to set in. I turned to Lydia, who had followed me into the hallway. Her smile was gone, replaced by an unreadable expression. "I can't find her." Lydia leaned in close, so close I could smell the minty gum she was chewing. "Try the basement," she whispered. My stomach twisted. I hated the basement. It was unfinished, cold, and filled with old junk. I hadn't even thought to check there because Emma was scared of it. But Lydia's suggestion rang in my ears, and a feeling of dread settled over me. "I don't think she's down there." "Oh, she is, and she's probably waiting for you." The door creaked open, and the smell of damp concrete wafted out. I hesitated, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that Emma was down there, frightened or hurt. I took a deep breath and followed Lydia down the narrow wooden stairs, each step creaking beneath my feet. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb that flickered occasionally. "Emma!" I called out, my voice echoing. The only answer was the soft hum of the light above. Then Lydia turned off the bulb. The basement was plunged into pitch darkness, and I screamed, my heart pounding like a drum. I fumbled to find the light switch, but Lydia's cold hand grabbed mine. "Shh! They don't like loud noises." "They?" I whispered back, terrified. The sound of soft giggling echoed from the far end of the basement. It sounded like Emma, but distorted, wrong. Lydia let go of my hand, and I stumbled backward, desperately searching for the staircase. My hands finally found the railing, and I scrambled up, my legs shaking. Bursting into the light of the hallway, I slammed the basement door shut and locked it. My whole body was trembling. Moments later, the door rattled, as if someone or something was trying to get out. I backed away, gasping for breath. And then Emma's voice called from upstairs. "I'm in my room." I ran to her, nearly tripping on the stairs in my hurry. She was sitting on her bed, her dollhouse in her lap, looking at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Where were you?" I demanded. "Were you in the basement?" Emma shook her head. "No, I was playing up here." Before I could say anything else, the front door slammed shut. I rushed to the window and saw Lydia walking down the driveway, her figure fading into the night. My parents never mentioned her again, and when I tried to ask, they said they didn't even remember hiring her. But I did. I remembered Lydia, the basement, and that distorted giggle that haunted my dreams for years. And to this day, I still wonder what exactly she had been playing hide and seek with down in the basement. When I was 9 years old, my parents hired a new babysitter named Rachel. She was around 19, cheerful, and always wore bright colors. My parents loved her because she seemed so sweet and attentive, but my younger brother, Ethan, and I quickly realized that there was something very wrong with Rachel. It started the first evening she watched us. My parents had gone out for dinner and left Rachel in charge. We were playing in the living room when she asked, "Do you guys want to hear a story?" She had a big smile on her face, one that seemed too wide, almost forced. "Sure," Ethan replied, always eager for a tale. Rachel leaned forward, her long wavy blonde hair spilling over her shoulders. "Once upon a time," she began, her voice suddenly low and serious, "there was a house. In this house there lived 2 children, a boy and a girl, but the house had secrets, dark secrets." Ethan and I exchanged nervous glances. Her voice had become unnervingly monotone, almost robotic. Rachel didn't even blink as she continued, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond us. "Every night, when the children were left alone, they came. The things from the walls, they would whisper and move, always waiting for a chance to come out." I swallowed hard. The room seemed to get colder, shadows stretching across the walls as if they were listening to their story. "Rachel, that's kind of creepy." She didn't seem to hear me. Her eyes were locked onto the far corner of the living room. "Sometimes the walls want you," she whispered, and then she snapped out of it, her wide smile returning. "Okay, your turn, Ethan. Tell a story." Her voice was suddenly bright and cheery again, but Ethan just shook his head, looking pale. I felt a chill run down my spine. That night, after she had tucked us into bed, I couldn't sleep. The way Rachel's demeanor had shifted us still gnawing at me. Every creak in the house made me jump. It felt like something was breathing alongside the walls, whispering as they expanded and contracted with the night air. Sometime after midnight, I was woken up by Ethan's terrified scream. I ran to his room, and there he was, sitting up in his bed, tears streaming down his face. "They're in the walls! I can hear them!" Before I could comfort him, Rachel appeared in the doorway. Her smile was gone, replaced with an empty, hollow stare. "Shh, you'll wake them." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Rachel's eyes were wide now, almost unblinking. "The things in the walls. They don't like loud noises." I grabbed Ethan's hand and pulled him out of bed, backing away from her, but Rachel didn't move. She just stood there, watching us. Her head tilted slightly, and her eyes seemed wrong, glassy and distant. "Where are Mom and Dad?" I demanded. Rachel's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. "Oh, they're having such a good time, but you need to keep quiet now. If you're not quiet..." She trailed off, and we heard it. A scratching sound. It came from the walls, soft at first, then more insistent. Ethan clung to me, trembling. "Stop it!" I shouted, even though I didn't know who I was talking to. "Rachel? The walls?" The scratching stopped, and Rachel cocked her head as if she were listening. Then she let out a small giggle. "Time for bed," she said, her cheerful demeanor returning in an instant. But we didn't move. We stood frozen until she walked out of the room and closed the door behind her. Ethan and I huddled together, wide awake, waiting for the nightmare to end. After what felt like hours, we finally heard the familiar sound of the garage door opening. Mom and Dad were home. We bolted out of the room, racing downstairs. "Sweetie, what's wrong?" my mom asked us as we threw ourselves at her, tears pouring down our faces. We tried to explain what had happened, but the words tumbled out too fast and jumbled. My dad looked confused, then turned to Rachel, who just stood there smiling. "They had a bit of an overactive imagination tonight," she said sweetly. I expected my parents to believe her, but then my mom frowned. "Rachel, why do you have scratches on your arms?" Rachel's smile faltered, and she quickly pulled her sleeves down. "Oh, it's nothing." My dad's face grew dark, and Rachel's sweet demeanor cracked. Without another word, she grabbed her bag and left the house, practically running out the door. We never saw her again, and my parents never found a babysitter through that agency again either. But the strangest part? A week later, when we were cleaning out the living room to rearrange some furniture, my dad had discovered something. Behind a large bookshelf, the wallpaper was ripped, and deep, jagged scratches were gouged into the wall, like something had tried to claw its way out. I was 11 years old when my parents hired a babysitter named Mr. Jenkins. Unlike the typical teenage girls who watched us, Mr. Jenkins was older, maybe in his late 40s, with graying hair and round glasses that perched on at the end of his nose. He wore a brown jacket and always smelled faintly of mothballs and peppermints. My parents said he was a retired teacher who had taken up babysitting for extra cash. He seemed polite and friendly enough, so I didn't think much of it. That first night, everything felt strange. Mr. Jenkins had a way of making the house feel colder, even though the heater was running. My little brother Max and I tried to watch TV, but Mr. Jenkins kept pacing the living room, his footsteps creaking over the hardwood floor. He would occasionally pause, looking at us with this odd, lingering stare, like he was trying to memorize every detail. "Do you kids believe in stories?" he asked suddenly, his voice deep and calm. Max, who was 7 and more trusting, looked up. "What kind of stories?" Mr. Jenkins stopped pacing and smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "The old stories, the ones about things that live in dark places. Things that like to watch and wait." I felt a chill run down my spine. "We don't really want to hear any scary stories," I said quickly, hoping to brush him off. Mr. Jenkins chuckled softly. "Oh, don't worry. You don't have to believe in them for them to be real." Then he turned and walked into the kitchen, humming some old tune that echoed in my mind. One that sounded oddly familiar and unsettling. Max, still shaken, came to sit closer to me. We decided to go upstairs and play video games in our room, hoping that being away from Mr. Jenkins would make things feel normal. But even up there, The house felt different, heavy. It was as though something was pressing down on the air. At some point, I realized I was thirsty. I told Max to stay put and made my way down the stairs. As I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. Mr. Jenkins was standing in front of the open refrigerator, but he wasn't looking for anything. He was whispering to it, his voice so soft and rhythmic that I almost thought he was praying. I backed up, but the floor creaked under my foot. His head whipped around, and his glasses glinted in the light. He closed the refrigerator door slowly, never breaking eye contact. "Everything all right?" he said, his voice even, but his eyes sharp. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just getting some water," I said, grabbing a glass and filling it quickly at the sink. I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. My hands were shaking so badly that water splashed onto the counter. "Have you ever felt like someone was watching you?" he asked, still staring at me. I swallowed hard. "No, not really." Mr. Jenkins took a step closer. "Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the shadows are long, that's when they come. The Watchers." His smile widened. "They're curious about people, especially children." I ran upstairs without even answering him, my heart pounding in my chest. I told Max we had to stay in the room and lock the door. I didn't want to scare him, but I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Jenkins' weird, ominous words. Hours passed and the house grew darker. The only light came from the street lamp filtering through our curtains. Max had fallen asleep, but I couldn't. I kept listening for any sound from downstairs, but everything had gone eerily silent. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps coming up the stairs. They stopped right outside our door. I held my breath, gripping the small flashlight I had kept under my bed. The doorknob rattled slightly, like someone was trying to open it. I crawled out of bed as quietly as I could and pressed my ear to the door. "Are you awake?" Mr. Jenkins' voice drifted through the wood, but it was different, hollow and echoing. "I think it's time for a midnight game," he said. I stumbled back, tripping over a toy on the floor. My heart was racing and I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, the doorknob went still, and I heard his footsteps moving away. About a few minutes later, I mustered the courage to peek out the window. My heart almost stopped. Mr. Jenkins was in the backyard, standing perfectly still, looking up at our window. The moonlight cast his face in sharp relief, and his eyes seemed even darker now. Mr. Jenkins was in the backyard, standing perfectly still, looking up at our window. The moonlight cast his face in sharp relief, and his eyes seemed darker, almost empty. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He lifted his hand and slowly pointed at our room. That was when my parents pulled into the driveway. The headlights swept over the yard, and Mr. Jenkins stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from view. By the time my parents came inside, he was gone. His coat was still hanging on the hook by the door, but there was no sign of him. He hadn't even been paid yet. My parents didn't believe me when I tried to explain what happened. They said I must have imagined it, that Mr. Jenkins had probably gone home and forgotten his jacket. But Max and I never saw him ever again, and the babysitting agency had no record of anyone by that name. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and feel like someone's watching me. I can't shake the memory of Mr. Jenkins standing in our yard, pointing, with that empty, hollow look in his eyes.